Hello, I'm so pleased to be here today. I'd like to just introduce myself. My name is Paula Moya, and I am the director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University. I want to welcome you to this event that we're all very excited about. It is part of the Imagining Justice project that we are proud to sponsor, being led by Professors Jisha Menon and David Sklansky. Now, before we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone people. We would like to show a short video made by our students to acknowledge this history and impact.
Stanford sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe,
who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was, and continues to be, of great importance to Native people.
We recognize that every member of the community has benefited
and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land.
Consistent with our values of community and diversity,
we have a responsibility
to
acknowledge and make visible
the university's relationship to Native people.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for this event, without which this wouldn't have taken place, among which are the Stanford Arts Institute, the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, the Stanford Faculty Women's Forum, and the Native American Studies Program. So it gives me pleasure now to introduce one of my colleagues here at Stanford, Professor David Sklansky, who is the Stanley Morrison Professor of Law, and he will now take over.
Thank you, Paula. And thanks all of you who are joining us today. This event, as Paula mentioned, is part of Imagining Justice, which is a project that curates a series of conversations situated at the intersection of race, humanities, and criminal justice. These conversations offer an opportunity to examine the ethical, cultural, political, and social issues raised by concerns around the criminal justice system. We hope these interdisciplinary conversations provide a renewed engagement with the history of race and criminalization, as well as a look forward towards the horizon of racial justice. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our speakers today, starting with our principal speaker, who is my newest colleague, Professor Elizabeth Reese, Yonpovi. Professor Reese is a scholar of American Indian tribal law, federal Indian law, and constitutional law here at Stanford Law School. Her work focuses on the intersection of identity, race, citizenship, and government structure. She has examined the way that government structures, citizen identity, and the history that's taught in schools can impact the rights and powers of oppressed racial minorities within American law. Professor Reese is a nationally recognized expert on tribal law and federal Indian law, and a frequent media commentator on developments within the doctrine, particularly at the US Supreme Court. Her scholarship on tribal law, constitutional law, popular sovereignty, and voting rights law has been published in the Stanford Law Review, the University of Chicago Law Review, the Cardozo Law Review, and the Houston Law Review. Before coming to Stanford, Professor Reese worked at the National Congress of American Indians, where she supported tribal governments across the country as they implemented expanded criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians under the 2013 Violence Against Women Act. Her comprehensive 5-year report on the tribal prosecutions thus far, which documented not only outcomes and unforeseen complications, but the surge of tribal law invocation, the surge of innovation in tribal law brought on by expanded jurisdiction, has been widely cited everywhere from Congress to briefs before the Supreme Court. Professor Reese began her legal career as a civil rights litigator at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she led a desegregation case in one of the largest school districts in Florida and worked on the challenge to Alabama's voter identification law. So you can see why I'm so pleased that she's now my colleague. Her talk today is called The American Indian Tribal Laws of Criminal Responsibility. But before I turn it over to Professor Reese, I want to mention that we're also going to have comments today by Abby Abinanti, the Yurok Chief Judge, who is an enrolled Yurok Tribal member. Judge Abinanti holds a JD from the University of New Mexico School of Law, and she was the first California tribal woman to be admitted to the State Bar of California. Judge Abinanti was a state judicial officer, that is a commissioner for the San Francisco Superior Court for over 17 years, where she was assigned to the Unified Family Court, which deals with family dependency and delinquency. She retired from the Superior Court in September 2011, and on July 31st, 2014, was appointed as a part-time commissioner for San Francisco assigned to dependency and a duty judge for that court, where she served until 2015. She's been a Yurok Tribal Court judge since 1997 and was appointed Chief Tribal Court Judge in 2007, a position she held in conjunction with her Superior Court assignment until 2015. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Reese.
Thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction. So first, I want to thank everyone for inviting me to come and talk about tribal law and the many exciting things happening across Indian country. I'm also going to introduce myself in my traditional native language, which is Tewa. So Navi Toa Hawe, Yampovi, Navi Americana Hawe, Elizabeth Reese, Na Nambe Winge Weang Omu. So the translation of that is really just that my name is both in my native language, Yampovi, which translates in English to willow flower, but then my name is also in what we would say American, but English, Elizabeth Reese. So, and I come from Nambe Pueblo, which is a small tribal community just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. So thank you so much for having me here. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. All right, so I'm talking today about tribal law and criminal responsibility. So the first thing that I think we need to start with is maybe just some terminology. So I'm gonna today, first of all, use the word Indian, and I'm gonna probably use it a fair amount. I realize that is gonna be surprising to a fair number of people, but what I want to start off saying is that Indian tribe and Indian country, at least within the law, and I'm a law school professor, are legal terms that have specific meaning within the law. And for that reason, they have a particular use and importance, regardless of the various debates going on within sort of culture and broader communities about their accuracy or political context. So for that reason, you are going to hear me use them. However, tribes, of course, have names for themselves, and that's not necessarily going to be the same thing. Tribes call themselves variously nations, pueblos, bands, etc., and that doesn't necessarily connotate like a different legal status. It's really just a different name, and so please keep that in mind. Also, Indian, American Indian, Native American, Native, etc. Of course, these have different political histories and contexts, and there are different debates about which one we should be using, etc. But they're all just, for the most part, technically synonyms. And in my opinion, really, they're synonyms for an idea that's not really even the most important thing. These are English words for what's ultimately just an imperfect and somewhat meaningless grouping, aside from the current delineation of borders and maybe our shared experience of colonialism. We were tribal communities that had an identity rooted in our particular tribes. That's the boundary and identity that has, real cultural meaning. But I think the best way to think about it is that, Native or Native American is just as broad, covering an entire continent and diverse group of people as words like Asian, right? So use them sort of carefully and precisely, but not inaccurately, to sort of say that this means more in terms of a cultural identity or national identity or political identity than they necessarily do. And also note that First Nations means something else, that's Canada, and that Indigenous also means something else. Indigenous is a broader term. As much as it has also gained clout, it's also, slightly imprecise to be changing Indigenous in and out for Indian, American Indian, or Native American, because those carry the political connotation of specifically within the United States, or at least within the broader colonized peoples of the United States. And so, you could say Indigenous people of the United States, but broad indigeneity is a worldwide thing. And so one thing I want to call attention to as we're thinking through these ideas and the different types of things happening with Indigenous people across the world is, of course, just being mindful of precision, and that we're not also dehumanizing or romanticizing Native people with sort of flattening them out. So please be mindful of that. So I'm here to talk a little bit about imagining justice in Indian country. And so I thought I would break this talk roughly down into 3 parts. The first is just a bare bones introduction into what tribal law is, under the assumption that many of you in the audience, especially coming from the broader parts of the Stanford community, or those maybe interested in just criminal justice issues and reform in the United States, aren't necessarily familiar with tribal governments, Indian law, tribal law, what I'm even talking about. And so this is an important foundational point to hit home. And then second, this idea of survival, change, and growth, and how these sort of animating questions are playing such a really important role in what's happening in Indian country and in tribal communities as they're wrestling with these different questions, and innovations are coming up within them. And then finally, talking a little bit about some of the exciting things that are happening and some of the lessons from Indian country that we can maybe learn about how to really, as this talk series alludes to, just imagine what justice can look like in a community setting, both in criminal justice settings, but also in other dispute resolution settings as well. So first, let's think about what is tribal law. So for those of you who don't already know, there are actually 574, yes, I know, it's a big number, federally recognized tribes in the United States. Why maybe have you not necessarily heard about them or thought about them? Well, that's actually not much of a mystery. There's a heavy force of colonialism, and the way that we are sort of taught to think about tribes, that's doing a lot of work starting when we're first in schools, to sort of erase and delegitimize these governments as real governments, as meaningful authorities that used to govern the United States and now maybe might make the current regime of governance in the United States look like problematic taking. So what sort of happened is, this idea that tribal governments and their laws are this other, they're a different thing, a cultural outsider. They must, I think we end up assuming, because of the way the types of images and stereotypes mainstream America has grown up with, think they must be small. So then, inherently lesser than the justice systems, the government systems we have in the rest of mainstream United States. And also then they're invisible. What's really happening is not something that people sort of see or if they do see clearly, it ends up being something that instead gets predominated by a lot of stereotypes or assumptions that make it very difficult, even for people who might want to go and see what's going on in a tribal community, to enter that relationship in a fully sort of respectful and open-minded way, because you come in with all of these sort of ugly cultural stereotypical assumptions that come from the colonial project of the United States and the position it needs to have Native people and Native nations in order to sort of justify these colonial takings over time. So what I really want to emphasize is that you should remember that tribes are just governments, right? They are governments within the United States who have to do a lot of this work of governing. In fact, they have to do a lot of the broad work of governing. When I'm explaining to folks what kind of government a tribe is, the best analogy is it's kind of like a state, but actually in a lot of ways with some more freedoms and responsibilities than states have to make the laws governing their communities, but also some other limitations, which I'll talk about in a sec. But what that means is that tribes have a lot to do when it comes to self-government. They have to pass laws in all of these different areas that we traditionally think of as, composing a legal system, right? So the idea that, tribes are sort of an irrelevant part or an invisible part of the system, makes no sense. Like, tribes are a huge part of the lawmaking that's happening and the self-government work that's happening in the United States. And there's, reminder, 574 of them. And of course, this includes a tremendous amount of work in the criminal justice space. So, right from, of course, the passage of laws. So here's an example picture of the Navajo Nation legislature, which is the body responsible for passing laws, passing the criminal codes that are going to govern what the tribe is doing, and how it's going to be prosecuting the various individuals who break laws on their lands, deciding what's criminalized, what's not, what sentences they're going to carry, what procedures, etc. Of course, there's judges at different levels, different capacities. There are different tribal court systems that have different levels. Trial courts, which have might be in a familiar way, have a jury box, and of course appellate courts as well. Tribes also then run police forces, have to have various laws governing that, the misconduct of police. There was a big Supreme Court case recently about the scope of tribal police powers. And many tribes also run their own correctional rehabilitation facilities as well. So the thing to keep in mind, though, about tribes and tribal governments is that they're not, just simply an American government in a, easy, clean way. They didn't come from the Constitution the way that states, or they didn't, the way that the federal government did. They didn't sign the Constitution the way that states did. Instead, tribes are something else. They are the surviving governments that used to control the United States, right? They are what used to be, and what has now been instead admitted to the United States, not through this process of consent, but really through this process of conquest. And that really changes and complicates a lot of the history and the contemporary reality of tribal governments and tribal sovereigns as they're navigating what it means to develop their systems now, because they have gone through a history where a lot of their choices were taken away from them in terms of what types of systems they wanted to have. Many tribes were forcibly relocated, so they don't even exist on the land base that they used to. So they're in a process of, depending on the unique history of the tribe, both building and rebuilding and reflecting and thinking about continuity, et cetera. So that's a really, complex and dynamic thing, all within the shadow of now ostensibly being a part of the United States as what we call a domestic dependent nation, with a particular legal status within that framework, which is always changing a bit, and probably not as defined as oftentimes we would like it to be. So, as a reminder, tribes have a lot to do. Tribes are doing a lot of different work in the governing space, especially when it comes to them and their membership on their reservation lands. But it's within this limited and complicated position, all sort of thanks to the colonialism that tribal governments have endured through the United States, but also other sovereigns. In the case of my community, Pueblo peoples, we were part of New Spain for a very long time, and then Mexico, and then the United States only, fairly recently, which is an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about our history and what our legal structure means. So what does this colonialism mean? So it becomes this sort of backdrop, right, for what tribes are doing, how tribes are navigating, what it means to have a government and a government system today, because a lot of the sort of new status and powers they have are sort of limited because they are within this history and context, and also because they're sort of, depending on the history, emerging from maybe even periods where the federal government said, oh, you need to adopt this type of government, or, we highly encourage you to make this certain reform. And there's a lot of different pressures that tribes are really only recently starting to push back against, and more so assert their own independence in developing government structures and laws that are best suited for their contemporary communities. So colonialism ends up both being this backdrop, but also unfortunately having this work of limiting tribal law and tribal government powers, because the United States has been very skeptical of the ability of tribal governments to, particularly when it comes to non-Indians, administer sort of law and justice with fairness and equality. I could talk at length about why this is fairly just hypocritical, but I will leave that maybe for Q&A. However, what I like to think about this and why I made this graphic is that the limiting of tribal government authority isn't necessarily a coherent thing that happened or a clean thing that happened. Instead, it's something that's happened with like little chunks of tribes' ability to do certain things being either taken away by Congress or by different court opinions, which means that tribes are navigating a very strange framework and a very complicated also federal bureaucracy that's telling them what they can and cannot do. And so they're both trying to sort of occupy that space and then do things to the best of their ability. What that has really meant, though, is that yes, this is incredibly challenging, but there's also a lot of innovation that's coming out of this. I sort of struggle with actually whether innovation is a good word, because so much of this is not actually, well, I guess to me it seems an instance of how English is limited in how we're describing this, because a lot of what's happening in tribal communities, as I'll show in a second, is not these brand new ideas. It's about also reaching back to old ideas and making those work as well, and finding the truth and the strength and the brilliance in old ideas as well. And is that innovation? I'm not sure if that totally fits. But so now onto survival, change, and growth. So just, pause for a second and let's do a thought experiment, which is to think about what it means to you to be whatever identity you have. Let's say American and Californian, and what it might mean to lose all of that. And not just your citizenship, but also the way of life that tends to color every other part of your identity and the way that you move through this world. So say that aliens showed up and they invaded and there was a war and they burned down almost all of the buildings and constructed new crazy strange structures made out of crystal or something. And there was only a pocket of, I don't know, suburbia left in America. And there was only one, I don't know, McDonald's or In-N-Out. I guess it's supposed to say In-N-Out because I'm in California now. In-N-Out burger left. How would we feel about that? How would we feel about maybe if there were only a few surviving religious buildings left or government buildings left? How would we feel about music and the songs and rock and roll and all of these things? So I brought up this thought experiment to make, you think about the simple point that the tremendous loss created by colonialism makes what a lot of Native communities have left incredibly precious, not only in terms of culture, but also in terms of government, every aspect of way of life. And what that means is that a lot of Native communities are very careful, and you will, I think, see, and you will see this playing out in a lot of the decision making that happens to protect and preserve what is there, and to give it utmost care and respect, both in terms of all of this cultural stuff, this free-floating things that make up who we are, but of course also our own people, right? Who in the end become also something that is incredibly precious to what it means to survive. So these heightened stakes create this heightened consciousness, I think, in a lot of tribal communities. So who are now that they're finally enjoying, in a lot of times, new space and freedom to rebuild for themselves again, are doing so while asking some really important and hard questions, which I think are, when they're done well, just brilliant. So first of all, a lot of tribal communities are really asking themselves, like, what does it really mean to survive as our people and as ourselves? Like, who were we? Who are we? And who do we want to be? And finally, things like, does this, X, fill in the blank, XYZ, government practice, law, structure, et cetera, does this work for us? Is it working? And the reason that I highlight that these types of questions are going on in a talk like this is that so much of, I think, a lot of failings within reforms and within the status quo of legal systems is a lot of times also tied to an inability to have a dynamic relationship with the status quo, right? To be always kind of questioning and checking in with who you are and why you are the way you are and what's important. And one thing that I think you do see happening in a lot of Native communities and legal systems right now is a really heightened checking in and awareness of all of this. And I think that is a huge part of the story of what's going on and some of the best things that are coming out right now. So now I'm going to talk about just some lessons and examples of some of the more exciting things happening in Indian country, in tribal law, in tribal communities with regards to criminal justice. And they're going to highlight exactly some of the things that I've sort of raised already, sort of not only just this complex history, but this constant sort of questioning and heightened sense of responsibility and care that communities are exhibiting. So first, peacemaking and restorative justice courts. So this is a very culturally grounded practice of, they can happen in a lot of different ways. And for that reason, I don't have a great statistic to give all of you about, exactly how and where this is happening all the time, because in some ways, this is happening fairly organically in the ways that certain judges are just conducting their courtrooms in tribal courts. And in other ways, it's a more formalized thing. It's actually something that gets put into a tribal code as a formal process for peacemaking or restorative justice that can come in either in the civil or criminal or both. So what I think sort of grounds some of the core of these things is, of course, a cultural grounding, that this is something that in each tribal community is rooted to their unique culture, and it creates this important buy-in and important meaning for that community, as opposed to thinking about it like, oh, what a great idea to have peacemaking and restorative justice, one size will fit all. Like that's not what's happening. It's all very rooted in each community and their ways of doing things, and those things that are sort of precious and meaningful to them. Second, it's involving a lot of long-term thinking. So what does it mean to get what's best for folks and for their community as well, both with sort of past and present? Like, how do we think of justice and harm and who someone is as they're coming into a courtroom, both what everything that's happened that sort of brought them there, which is also, very historical context rooted in all of this sort of ugliness and colonialism, oftentimes that I've referred to. But then also, how does that reach forward? So not just thinking about, okay, what did you do and what's the proper penalty, but how did you get here and how do we walk with you forward? So this different scope. And then also, of course, then a skepticism of the adversarial process itself as necessarily being the best way of doing things. So a lot of the models of peacemaking and restorative justice in tribal communities instead think that sort of reaching to the whole, everyone involved at different aspects of the court, and also different parts of the community is a better way of doing things than sort of turning it into an adversarial proceeding that makes it a fight with a winner and a loser, where it's not about how we walk away all feeling good or like we've resolved something, but instead about who could win the fight. So here's an example. I mentioned some tribes, very clearly codify these within their codes. The Navajo Nation is one of them. So here's just a screenshot of some of the Navajo tribal code, which actually puts into place their peacemaking court system. So the next example is the tribal healing and wellness courts. So there's about 75 to 100, I think. But because tribes operate in a lot of ways fairly independently, and they're not under the supervision of the federal government in ways that would mean that they have to sort of check in constantly. I don't totally know. The experts who work with them, try to reach out and compile lists and get best practices, et cetera. And so based on those estimates, it seems like it's probably 75 to 100 tribal healing and wellness courts operating throughout Indian country. And these courts really grow out of the model of drug courts but then evolved differently within Native communities to, very much like peacemaking courts, have this important cultural grounding that is unique to each tribal community, that is informed by that tribe's cultural values and practices, and that creates, materials, et cetera, and practices that make sense and are really organically growing from this tribe. So they look they look somewhat different in each tribal community. And that's, I think, very much because they should. They are culturally grounded to that community, because Indian country is diverse. Remember, I said Native American. What really is that? It's a broad grouping for hundreds of different cultures across an entire continent. And these courts also have a really strong community focus. It requires a tremendous amount of sort of buy-in and support, not just from the folks who go through these programs and all of the different court actors who are incredibly involved and dedicated to the work of supporting them as they're going through these programs, but also the community broadly. And that is a different, I think, relationship requirement than a lot of times what you see in state criminal justice systems. And then finally, also an awareness of this context and the history of what leads folks to be in a lot of these situations, and what it means to sort of work with them to move forward. So here is the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. They break things out into some buckets of sort of key components of good tribal courts, and have done amazing work in identifying the work of healing and wellness courts throughout the years and what makes them so successful in Indian country, and also providing guides for how tribal communities can develop such court systems if they don't have them already. So, and finally, the final lesson example comes from my work with the tribes who were implementing the Violence Against Women Act of 2013, which allowed for expanded criminal jurisdiction. So I'm not going to give a mini lesson in Indian law, but basically tribes, as part of the Swiss cheesing of their authority, yes, remember that slide? Tribal governments are not able to prosecute non-Indians for crimes committed within their territory, and that's led to a massive amount of public safety problems, and particularly violence against Native women. And Congress passed a fix for that, a very limited fix, which allowed tribes who opted to do so to prosecute non-Indians for domestic or dating violence crimes only. And so I worked with a bunch of tribes as they were doing this work, prosecuting non-Indians for the first time in a long time, under very intense scrutiny and a spotlight from the federal government because of all of this skepticism of their authority. And one of the things that I thought was brilliant was there was all of this fear, even behind the passage of the act, that non-Indians would be treated poorly by tribes and tribal governments because they would be treated like outsiders, right? And that there would be the same kind of, I think, othering that Native people, I think, have experienced, that Native people would then do to non-Native people who were coming into their justice systems. And one of the things that I think was really surprising, not really surprising to me, but was great to see, and I hope to, that the work in the report surprised some of the skeptics in Congress, was that that's not what happened. Instead, a lot of tribes really described the folks who were non-Indians who were committing these crimes as part of their community. as folks who were, in relationship with members of their community who had, who were parents of tribal children, et cetera, and were looking at it in a broad way, such that they were extending a lot of care to these folks as well, in a way that was really, I think, also moving for a lot of those folks who would otherwise be in a state system that would not have operated with that much sense of sort of community and care. The other thing that was great was also the sense of collaboration across adversarial actors. So even though the statute required folks to have public defenders provided in tribal courts, the public defenders and prosecutors and tribal court judges were often in conversations in ways that I think were a lot less sort of hostile and adversarial in the ways that you see playing out in state systems. And I think that's because of the normed ways that these communities think about their justice system as involving all of these actors working together, and not acting like different parts of a sports team, rival sports teams. And then finally, this best practice information sharing. So one of the things that folks in Indian country struggle with a lot in criminal justice is just all of these different problems that have to do with like a lack of information, lack of data, like certain things that are difficult for one tribe, and then where actually working together and like sharing the best practices that one tribe is dealing with, or working together to advocate for a solution to, for example, all get access to certain databases, et cetera, can become a really powerful tool once the tribes who were doing this type of work actually sort of gathered together and sort of met to share the best practices of that. So to think about this work of criminal justice prosecution as something that they wanted to share in together, sort of developing as a sort of many tribal community. So with that, so those are my brief remarks, just sort of kicking off some of these sort of questions and examples of what criminal justice can look like and what imagining tribal justice systems looks like. But mostly I am just excited that Judge Abby is here because my work does talk about this type of justice system. And I've had the experience of working with folks in these justice systems. But the most important thing I think oftentimes say is, like, listen to the people who are really doing it. And that is not me. I am someone who wants to just shine spotlights on those people. And so I'd really love to hear from Judge Abby a bit about her experience, especially running some of the courts and engaging in some of the practices that I discussed up there at Yurok, just north of me. So thank you so much, Judge Abby, for coming and agreeing to this talk. It's very rare for me to have one of my role models and heroes just come and chat with me about the stuff that I work on and care about. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is why you need a team. You have somebody like her who is smarter, tougher, and who can communicate with these people and not insult them because they don't like that, whether they deserve it or not, is really not the point. Because I would say something like, the reason they act like this, i.e. they're afraid that we will treat them differently, is projection. And that's the kind of thing they don't want to hear. She said it much nicer, but it was the same thing. All right. And so what you have to understand about this is that we need, as a team, to move forward. Because in fact, the sad part of this is that the system that they have set up in our country isn't working for them either. So it isn't just about what are the tribes doing. The tribes are looking at the injustice that they've created. And as I often say, they've managed to junk this place up in a couple of 100 years after we had it for thousands of years. And that, although it's some kind of record, isn't one that one should likely brag about, but they appear to be bragging about it. And when you look at our justice systems, we had a value system underpinning them that is much different than the value system that they have. And that's the difference, because from a value system come practices. And our practices are different. And Professor Reese said over and over, you have to know why. And that's our belief. Why did this happen? I used to sit on the bench in San Francisco, as was mentioned, and I would look out at some of these people and go, is that really a crime, or is that just felony stupid? I mean, really? And now I have to deal with this. Somebody needs to sit this person down and talk to them and help them do better. And that's the point. Because she talked a lot about, okay, walking together with the person. And that's what our justice systems were based on. They were based on interlocking responsibilities, not on I have a right to, and you have a right to do this, and you have to prove I did it. Well, anybody who has a tribal grandmother knows you don't have to prove anything to your grandmother. You either did it or you didn't. And when she asks you, you say it. You don't go, oh, I have a Fifth Amendment, unless you want to be sitting in the back room and tell you about 97. That just doesn't work. But once you say what you did, she will help you. She will help you work it out, no matter what it is. And she will love you through the whole process. She may be angry with you, but how it's addressed is much different. And so when we have these systems, it's about taking responsibility for what you've done. And also you have to understand that in the process, you have to give and you have to receive, because many of our prayers and many of our languages have as part of them something loosely translated as, please help us because we're only humans. So realizing where you are in the scheme of the world, you are actually not the top of the food chain, because let's hope not anyway, with the amount of mistakes that we make. There are others out here and there are other interlocking responsibilities. And so what we need to do is be protected while we rebuild our systems and an infrastructure that they can also then utilize. Because the mass incarceration, let's have this value system versus that. Okay, you can kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with your opioids and keep your billions of dollars and have no criminal responsibility. I can go out on the street and sell 5 pills and go to prison for 20 years. Wait a second. How does that work? Because I'm not following that. That doesn't make any sense at all as a system. But that's the system they have. So we have to work at that and we have to help them work at it. Because like I said, they are really making a lot of mistakes. And in the process, they're hurting a lot of people and they're hurting themselves. We're the largest surviving tribe in this state. And we survived because we ran and hid. Well, those days are behind us. That won't work anymore because their wrongdoing has gotten bigger and bigger. We have to come back out and engage and help them understand the way to move forward. And if we don't, then everybody is in a world of hurt here. Because it isn't just, okay, well, those tribes over there, they want to do their tribal thing. No, wait a minute. We want to do a thing that actually works as opposed to what you're doing. And maybe then, you can then adopt it. And that's exactly what she was saying about with VAWA and helping non-tribal members who are in our community. If they're here, they're our responsibility. So we have to help them get past it. And here's another example. We have the only, I think still the only state certified batterer intervention program. And we changed the curriculum so that state judges can actually sentence people to our 52-week program. And when we did that, we changed the curriculum to add in cultural components. And at some point, one of the local judges said, look, we lost our program for a while. Will you take a couple of ours? I said, of course, because they live in the same community, and I'm happy to do that for you. So we did that, and I made them do the same thing. You need to go back and talk to all the elders in your community and find out when violence came into your family. Because trust me when I tell you, you all came from a culture, and there are no intact cultures that said that's okay. Something happened to you. And many of you came to this country on the run from horrible things, and horrible things happened to you on the way here. And that's where the violence came. And they were shocked to know that and to go, okay, let me figure that out. And then to force them to look at it. And it's just another one of those ideas about, okay, we're a melting pot, which they were saying is check your culture at the door because we don't want it. Well, that's brilliant. Then exactly what are you going to have left? You're going to have that violence that was inflicted on you left, and that greed that made you go, okay, let's take this, let's take this. That's what you have left. That's not brilliant. And now we all have to live with it. And I think that's, what we're trying to look at now, and why this is so important. We're not outliers here. We're actually trying to get into the mainstream because the mainstream needs us to be there. And part of how we're going to do that is with people like her who hold them back while we get our infrastructure straightened up enough so that people go, oh, wait a second, I think I'm going to just try Judge Abby's way because she actually has a much higher rate of success. How did that happen? Now we're starting to have agreements with the state courts about diversion because they're going, oh, it works better over there, whatever they're doing. But I'll tell you what we're doing. We're doing what we always did. We're training advocates. And what do those advocates look like? I was talking to some people from the university yesterday about how they're training social workers. I said, this isn't working. I'll tell you how you train social workers. You train them like you would, like aunts and uncles act. That's how you train them. And you don't give them 5 million people on their caseload because they have to be friends with who they're working with, and they have to be available to each other so that they can walk with that person as that person is walking back to the right way and walking back to harmony. That's how you train them. And that's what you want in your communities. Because people don't just wake up and go, okay, well, magically I'm going to, learn all this, or I'm going to be this, or I'm going to be that. Because if you haven't had the opportunity to learn, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And certain skills, we were sitting with a bunch of social workers, and I said this to the people yesterday, and then we were all Yuroks, and they were talking about, we have such poor parenting skills and this and that. And I said, okay, let's talk about that for a minute. One, nobody's talking about the historical trauma and how that impacted, how each of the historical traumas that happened here impacted parenting skills. For instance, we're all Yurok mothers. So tell me exactly how somebody's going to walk into your house and take your child. I mean, these are all people I knew. And clearly everybody was going, well, they'd have to kill me because that's the only way you're going to come in and take my child. And I said, exactly. So all those people who came in and took their kids for boarding school or took their kids to be indentured slaves, those kids got to watch their mothers get killed. Now that, you don't need ACEs to tell you, that's probably a traumatic experience, okay? And then you get carted off to boarding school and or to be an indentured slave. And trust me, there wasn't much parenting going on there. So what do you, when you get old enough to run home, you run home, but you have a huge gap of knowledge on a very primary important skill set, how to be a parent. And then that just grows bigger until it becomes sort of like the giant, tomato that ate Chicago. Because if you don't have it, you don't have it. And it causes horrible problems. Well, I guess I just wanted to add that part into what you were saying.
Yeah, no, that was all. Thank you so much, Judge Abby. That was great. I have a sort of question that comes out of, so there's a documentary called Tribal Justice, which features Judge Abby and Judge Claudette White, who recently passed, and the work that they've been doing in their tribal communities that I highly recommend to folks. And I'm teaching a class here at Stanford, or a reading group, and folks watched it. My students watched it, and afterwards, one of the things they were really struck by was the approach that you take to being a judge, both in, not wearing robes and sitting, with folks, in the community. But also, as one of my students who is Black said right away, she was like, it was amazing to see the contrast between how often in the state court systems or federal system, the people doing the judging and in the court systems who have all of this power are so from such different communities and have such different experiences and lives than the people they're judging. And that this felt so different to see just Native people involved in all of this, and people who know each other in community. But that also made them wonder about how hard it would be to replicate parts of what makes some of our, like the tribal court systems that are doing this type of stuff work, because it seems so much based on these relationships and trust. And folks like yourself who have this authority and status within the community that matters and to people. And so I wonder, how do you think about that and what it would mean to, or how do you sort of answer that sort of fear or question about where this fits in the rest of, or could fit as an insight in the rest of the United States when the communities are so different, or maybe don't even exist in the same way outside tribal communities?
Well, I think human beings have a memory of village life, because that's basically where we all came from. So that it's not as hard as one might think if you just start suggesting it. Like when I first came home, people would go, "Oh, you can't be the judge because you know Liz." I'm like, "I know you all. We all grew up together. I'd like to not know some of you, and you'd like to not know me, but be that as it may, we did not do stranger justice ever for thousands of years. So every one of us has that internally, because we live that lifestyle, whether we were Native or not. We lived in these small communities, and the interest was to get along, and to have harmony. And I think, even if you suggest things like, I had a whole, when I first started, I would have all these calendar calls and get all these people in, and you go, "Okay, how many want trials and how many people just want to talk to me and try to figure this out?" And everybody went, "Oh, well, we'll just talk to you and try to figure it out." Okay. Well, that's a cultural choice. And you don't go, "Do you want a cultural choice, or do you want to, do this?" No, you go, "How many want it?" You just put out the choice, and people gravitate to it thinking it's their personal choice, which in a way it is, but it's their memory choice. And I think that's why they felt comfortable with it. and we would grapple with it about what did you say, what did they say, and why did you do this, or, don't do this again, or I'm going to be, really angry. And it's nothing worse than a mad old Indian lady, as everybody knows. So you're not going to really push that too far. So, it's that kind of memory is there, and it works. It allows the person to make a mistake and recover, or to go, no, it wasn't me. It was really my cousin who did it. And the cousin's sitting there going, yeah, it was, so then you deal with it, or this is something that you guys never should have let it get this far. I'm going to send you out to talk to one of the camp leaders to work this out. And if you don't work it out, then you're going to come back to me and I'm going to make a decision. And I can guarantee you that I will make you both unhappy, because this was on you. You should never have gotten this fight, So it's really that kind of part of the problem for us. And, we push everybody to go to school and you want people to get educated, but you have to also go, don't let that become your definition. Let that become something you consider. But, when we go to law school, they teach us as one thing as if it is a definition of justice. It is not. It is a definition, which is hugely different. And just because we didn't write it all down or have, things that they can compare it to or whatever, doesn't mean it wasn't alive and well. And it is alive and well. And I think you just start moving through it, and then people go, yeah, that works for me, or that worked, or, we better go talk to Judge Abby because we can't figure this out, or, how are we going to do this? How are we going to fix this? What should we do? This is what happened. And then you just help.
So one of the things I remember from law school, in sort of explaining also the idea of stranger justice and sort of the adversarial system, and a lot of the things that I think come to characterize the sort of status quo of justice in the rest of the United States is that it seems like it's both a safeguard against the government potentially harming people, that we would have all of not just things like public defender, but the adversarial process itself, and also different procedural things, which I think then have the effect of just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and creating a lot of the sort of system that ends up being what we have, that is, not based on community and, relationship, or, even often like truth and responsibility a lot of the time, but more sort of based on navigating procedures and such things. But, I wonder though, like there seems to be a logic to that desire for protections from government power that, like, in some ways, like kind of resonates with me a lot as an Indian, because I feel like, oh yeah, like I know the government can be terrible, because the federal government has been terrible. But then when it comes to my own community, I find myself wanting to believe in trusting there to not be a lot of structural protections that will get in the way of me having a trust and relationship with the authorities that I could go to there. But I frankly, I think struggle with that because I wonder what happens if the person who fills that role is not good or misbehaves, and what do we do, and what can we do to, or should we do to sort of come up with other protections in the cases of when, say there is like a bad judge who isn't treating the folks that they know well? How do you think through, that question?
We have two problems. One, what do you do if you have a dishonorable person? And two, what if you make a mistake?
Mhm.
Those are two different things. And one of the things that, I'm working with people here is you realize this, I used to sit on the bench and I would call 40 or 50 cases a morning sometimes. And I had to accept the fact that X number of decisions I made were wrong, statistically, period. Has to be. And so then you have to go, okay, then what do you do when you discover you've been wrong? How do you address that? So that's one category. And the other category is what happens if you have somebody who's being dishonorable. And our communities, like many communities, struggle with that, and it's sort of like, how do you meet, how do you deal with it? And I think you have to ground yourself in respect and honor. And when you have somebody who is doing something that is not grounded in that, then the community has to confront them, and that it may not happen, the act happens today, it may not happen tomorrow, but it will happen, and that's what you have to have. You have to build up the trust in that, because it doesn't mean just because somebody does a dishonorable act that you can't proceed in that non-formal basis still, in that sense of interlocking responsibilities, because many of us have been raised to that and will do it regardless, and do sometimes people go off the rails? Yes, and you have to be aware of that. And did we have people that we had to banish? Yes. On occasion for high crimes, we took the ultimate action against them. Yes, we did do that. And you can't forget about that. You're not saying, okay, well, we're not capable of being dishonorable, because we are. And that's the nature of humans. And so then you have to feel like, okay, how do you teach your community to go, no, that's not okay? And how do you go, okay, you can't participate in this anymore because this is what you've done. And we've had to face that issue on different issues, with different behaviors, and just say, it's your responsibility, either dance leaders or whatever, you have to address this. Now address it. Whether it's your clan leaders or whoever your leaders, and they have to address it. I mean, nobody wants to. It's like it's the kind of thing that you don't want to wake up in the morning and face. Who does? But that's how I think you have to deal with it. And that's what the elders can help you with, what the dance leaders can help. For us would be dance leaders, clan leaders, whoever. They have to participate and they have to come forward. Okay.
Well, this has been a terrific discussion. We do have time for questions from the audience. The screen has a Q&A function, which I did invite you to use. Some people have already submitted questions, and we'll be monitoring additional questions as they come in. And I guess I'd like to start off with a question both for Liz and for Judge Abby. And the question is, some of what you said already implicitly answers it, but I'd like you to speak a little more to it. But what I'd like you to talk about is, what would it mean for the United States as a whole to stop treating tribal criminal justice as lesser or exotic or smaller, or a footnote? What would it mean if we instead began to recognize that tribes administer and create important parts of criminal law in the United States? One thing it would mean is that we might notice that there are ways in which tribal criminal justice has advantages over criminal justice as is administered elsewhere. But would it mean anything else? Would it mean that we would change the relationship maybe between the federal and state criminal justice systems and tribal criminal justice systems? Would it mean that we would want to try to borrow or export some aspects of tribal criminal justice? What would it mean, in short, if we stopped treating tribal criminal justice as unimportant, exotic, more primitive, smaller, lesser than the criminal justice and criminal law we're more familiar with, or that many of us are more familiar with?
Yeah. So I want to highlight two things in answer to that. The first thing is just about what it would mean for the structure of federal law, federal Indian law, and tribal sovereignty, because I think my Swiss cheese slide should not exist if that were true, because there's so much about tribal laws and tribal sovereignty, and that is just so systemically disrespected in all of the court opinions and various acts of Congress, or that inform various acts of Congress that do the work of limiting their authority. And while it makes sense to allow, I guess Judge Abby said, also time for certain infrastructures to get built up in certain cases, I think there's a lot of there should be a reckoning coming with us feeling very uncomfortable with the parts of our law that really just say we can't trust these Indians to do the law and justice, because they are Indians, and and because that's really what is a huge part of this body of law is, and it should die. Those parts of it should die, so hopefully soon. So I think it would look like that, and it would look like judges looking at tribal law and deferring on questions of tribal law and when they come up, or implicated in questions when they come up in other court systems. So that's, I think, aspect one. Is I think it would be radically transformative on these other parts of law that impact the scope of tribal government powers. But I think the other thing that it would look like, and I think this is harder, is that I think it's a more complicated and nuanced point, is it would look like both what you're suggesting, David, that there would be space to sort of see what tribes are doing and say oh, that's great, that's brilliant, and as Judge Abby has also said, allow tribes to also sort of help save parts of the rest of systems within the United States that have not been working or have been broken. But I think it also means respecting tribes' agency over that choice. And I think one of the most harmful and difficult things about the relationship between Native people and the United States, especially, or just American people, and especially academics and tribes, is that what goes along with thinking of them as lesser and primitive is not respecting their own agency to engage with you on such things. So, showing up at a tribe and saying, oh, what a brilliant idea, I'm going to take that, without working with them, that is still a taking. If that is not okay, that doesn't respect them as full, capable agents the same way you would other legal systems and governments, if you're obtaining knowledge in ways that aren't okay, and that sort of blow through structural or cultural barriers. So I think it also means, it doesn't mean it's sort of opening of floodgates of borrowing practices. It means new era of respect and potential for good sharing and collaboration that looks very different than the history that we've had. David, you're muted.
Thanks, Liz. This is why it's nice to have younger colleagues, among other things. Judge Abby, in what ways would you like to see the federal court system and the state of California respect Yurok criminal justice more than is currently the case?
I mean, I think both systems have to problem solve around value systems as opposed to practices. You know, one of, I guess, a primary example would be, okay, you know, you have an Amber Alert system for when kids get kidnapped or whatever, but kids who go missing from foster care are not part of that. There is no system for that. Now that to me is a blatant failure of grown-ups. I mean, that's why you come with grown-ups, because you expect them to do something. You know, so you have these systemic issues that are not being addressed. You know, and so that's what I would like them to do, is look at their systemic issues and figure out a respectful way to address them. You know, and a value-based way to do it with responsibilities. You know, grown-ups have certain responsibilities. And I would think finding lost foster children would be one of them. You know, so that you have to look at all of that. And that's just one tiny example. But that's what I would like them to do, is stop going, well, let me catch somebody and send them to prison because this person took one child and we caught them with it. But what about the thousands of others? You know, what about that? You know, and so it's the wrong end of the problem solving, in my opinion.
We have a number of questions that all have to do in one way or another with the tension or the possible tension between culturally rooted systems of criminal law and criminal justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, the requirements of dealing with a pluralistic, diverse society. And you spoke about this a little bit, Liz, in connection with VAWA. But a number of people have asked about how that tension affects how we should think about possibly trying to borrow peacemaking or restorative justice or tribal healing and wellness courts, or even the culturally rooted batterer intervention program that you were speaking about, Judge Abby. Are these things that that can be ramped up, that can be scaled, or are they things that are so dependent on a closed, homogeneous community that they won't really apply outside the tribal context?
To me, they apply in every context. You know, humans are a context. And like I said, we all came from villages. Some of us moved into urban environments or whatever, but we need to take what we came from and use that. You know, and can they be scaled up? Of course they can, if we have the will to. You know, we've managed to scale up Facebook, whatever that is, you know, so I can imagine that we could scale up the rest of it. I personally, it's the old age thing, you know, don't do social media. I mean, I can spell it, but that's it. You know, so can you scale these things up? Yes, if you have the will to, you can. You know, because there's lots of really bright people in this country. They can do that. You know, and we just haven't said, solve this problem in this way. You know, we want to work on this issue in this urban area or in this state. And that's why I often go, let's try to do pilot projects so that we can then show people they can take it and use it and expand it. You know, this is very doable. I mean, they came here, look how they scaled up in a couple 100 years, for crying out loud. It's not impossible. They showed us that already. I mean, just because they scaled up into a monster, it doesn't mean that, it scale up into something else.
Liz?
Yeah, I think I agree, but it's also so tricky because I think about how important it is to have the kind of like self-aware, like cultural self-awareness and like constant questioning that like I had a whole like that I had those slides about, like asking those types of hard questions of yourself as a community, as a culture, as a nation, as you're going through a building type or scaling type process like that, and how rare that is for the United States to do that. And because what makes a lot of these things work, like, or what's important is to think about what makes them work, first of all. And it seems like a lot of what does in a lot of instances is, relationships and trust and like the boundaries of a community having a coherence that then has a buy-in for all of the people involved, and that makes sense, so that folks are all willing to do this work of supporting and grounding folks who do come to a point where they're struggling. And so I think there's, of course, there's going to be maybe naturally like the idea or instances where that could fit, with pre-existing communities, or the idea that existing communities, whether it's like religious communities or, school communities, like institutions can function this way. But what's hard about our justice system as it's currently constructed is that it is so big, and the boundaries of it don't have necessarily the cultural community coherence, such that the folks who walk into court systems feel like they're foreign and cold.
Well, I think part of it,
and that's, yeah.
I was
So I
going
don't
to
know how
say,
you fix that.
when I was on the bench in San Francisco at one point, nobody had given a baby to a male, to a father in dependency, without the mother being present. And I said to this man, choose. Your wife is in the throes of addiction. You have a child under one. You can have one or the other. You can't have both. And he said, I'll take baby. I said, fine. Then she's out, and this is what you do. And he said, I don't know what to do. I said, do you have a sister? Do women live in your apartment house? Does she go to daycare? They're all women. Ask. 3 months later, he came back. Girl looked like a princess. She had the life we all want, because he had got help. He needed to know who to ask and how to do it. And I said, I'll stay with you until you get this straightened out. But you can do this. Just because you haven't doesn't mean you can't. And that changed the whole dynamic in that court system about alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be willing to do that, and then to help them and say, here's the bridge for you. You can do this. Because he looked like, oh my God, what have I done? But it worked.
Yeah.
So we had an interesting question about history and how we should think about history in connection with the issues that the two of you have been talking about today. In other words, the present tribal governments that we have, to what extent are they continuous with the kinds of tribal governments that existed in pre-colonial times? How have these governments evolved? What kinds of tribal knowledge have been lost? What sort of forces have affected tribes historically? And does any of that affect how we think about, or how we should think about, the place of tribal law in American law more generally?
Yeah, so I think, so first of all, I think what I want to flag is that there are a lot of is that there's a way that that question both matters and doesn't. Because, and the way that it, I'll start with the way that it doesn't, that, you know, colonialism and the way that it's played out in the United States has been very complicated. And tribes have been moved, they've been split up, they've been, you know, smushed together, reconstituted, you know, et cetera. And so the idea of continuity creating legitimacy is both, it's not a fair standard given what's happened with colonialism, and it's also just not, it's not how people are. It's like governments don't and stay that way. I mean, the United States has changed a tremendous amount in the time that tribes have even been a part of it. And one of the, I think, problems that I think very much comes with the way that we have been ingrained to think about Indians as this thing that exists in the past and is very frozen. And the only like idea of a legitimate Indian was like the Indian that existed prior to colonialism, is that it's allergic to change. It means that whenever tribes make changes or do anything different, a lot of times it's seen as a departure from legitimacy. And that's a problem. You know, that's also, you know, a very intentional colonial move, because it means that, you know, tribes are like, they will be stuck and they will be incapable of, you know, evolving into contemporary governments that work in the, you know, like time period that we live in, which would be great, because then they would, you know, fail. And so that's the way that it doesn't matter. But the way that I think it does matter is with that consciousness that I alluded to, with asking the question, like, who were we? What does it mean to survive? Like, I like to think about it like at this baseline, like, would my great-great-grandmother recognize me as a Pueblo woman? Like, our government is a Pueblo government. And what does that mean? You know, does it mean, I think it means some core thing that matters, and really zoning in on those core things. And that's an act of, I think, reflection about who you are and what you want to be, and what it means to be a people. And that's what matters, but not necessarily even like a political or government continuity.
Yeah, and I think it really is, you know, we were evolving before they got here. We would have evolved. There was a break because of the invasion. But even if they had not shown up here, we would not look the same as we looked 250 years ago, because we didn't look the same 500 years ago. And you evolve to face problems. That's the other thing that happens. You know, when I say I have practices in this court, well, 200 years ago, when they came here, I didn't have opiates. I didn't have meth. I didn't have, you know, all this stuff. So I have to have practices to deal with that. You know, I couldn't say to somebody in wellness court, do you think you need to wear a patch? You know, because I didn't have a patch, you know, but I do now. I have new practices. But asking, you know, that's part of the same thing. Yes, you have to evolve your practices. Would we have evolved? Yes, we would have, because we always have.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so
And,
much.
you know, yeah, it doesn't always go, you know, like smoothly. You have some days that are like, you have to be kidding me, you know, and that you just have to accept that. That's part of being a human being.
Thanks so much to both of you. This has been a wonderful, really enlightening conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Paula at this point. Maybe not.
Paula ran away.
I'm going to do, I will thank both of you then on behalf of the center and the other co-sponsors of today's event. I've learned a lot. I feel even luckier than I did before that you're my colleague, Liz, and I feel really fortunate to have had you with us electronically today, Judge Abby. I also want to thank all the members of the audience who came and who submitted such great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to everyone.
Yeah.
But hopefully you found it as informative and inspiring a discussion as I did.
Soda.